Yes, hello everyone. So my name is Daniel, and today I'm going to present on Malpedia, which is a project that I've now been pursuing for almost 2 years. First, before we get into it, let me thank my co-workers on this one. So Martin helped a lot with the evaluation framework and statistics that we've used to present some of the results that are later in this talk. And Steffen basically programmed most of the website and platform that's basically used to deliver the data and interact with Malpedia. Elmar's my supervisor, and I'm always happy when I can talk to him and exchange ideas. So the outline for this talk is basically I start with a summary, so you get directly into the topic and what's it all about. Then I go back about 2 years in time, motivating how we came to that idea and what basically has happened until then. I give a layout of the approach that we have followed and then present Malpedia itself. And the next step is basically showing you what you can do with this corpus. So essentially what I'm presenting here is a very clean corpus of malware, of unpacked malware actually, and then going a bit in the future. So for the summary, what is Malpedia? So from the intention, it's basically a free, independent pooled resource for confidentially labeled unpacked reference samples for malware families and versions. So everything in one sentence basically means I try to have a good coverage of many families, then have their versions tracked as well, trying to limit it to as few samples as possible. So I want to have a small corpus that's still very representative, and I'm very happy to share this kind of data. At the same time, along with the samples, it makes sense to track all the metadata, because right now, if you think about it, how are you going to find blog posts on something? You go on Google, and that's a lot of effort. Otherwise, we could basically directly attach those references to the samples, so you have everything in one place. So that's one of the ideas here. And since we have a nice corpus, we can also basically test and develop our Yara rules against it. So that's just some of the ideas there. So looking about 1 week ago, I had roughly 2,500 malware samples there for around 670 families. And I'm targeting multi-platforms, so not only Windows malware, but also embedded stuff, IoT stuff, APKs, OS X, JavaScript, because that's a thing as well, and everything in that corpus. So the contributions of this work, because there's also a paper to it that will be released later on. First, we define some requirements that we think are a useful thing to follow if you're basically creating such a corpus, and then we provide our vision or our take on this corpus and the platform as well. And the second part is basically we do a comprehensive quantitative static analysis, so basically looking at the structure across all of those families and provide some results on that as well. So how did all of this begin? So who was at BotConf 2015? So some of you guys, I have to do it that way, might remember that there was this thing. So quite a bunch of DGA talks, and yeah, I'm one of those guys. So I basically presented on my previous project, which was DG Archive, so basically a clean collection of algorithmically generated domain names. However, as much ranting there was on DGAs, I still feel from the feedback I received that's a good project, because when you provide curated, systemized data, you can do really good stuff with it. And also, since it was launched, I had more than 1.5 million queries to DG Archive, so it seemingly is also used by some people. In 2015, there was another thing. Does anyone recall this slide? It's actually from a lightning talk. So there was this plug what? Plug X. So basically when Crowder gave his lightning talk on that we have a synonym problem basically with malware. So everyone is referring to stuff in a different way and we cannot really come to a consensus. And what he basically proposed is let's try to do something and fix it. I didn't really talk to him, but I thought also it was a good idea, because when I basically came back from BotConf, I looked at all the data that I had. So from several years I had basically the idea, I'm sitting on a pile of investigations that I've done, and the way that I structure them is normally probably by date. I have the sample, I might have a dump, might have unpacked samples, might have an IDB, some text and write-up for it, and while it's somewhat structured, it's still a mess. And what came to me is basically, it might be a good idea to do this in a way more structured fashion. So I thought having a code-centric inventory that's basically focusing on static analysis would be like really, really good, because we can basically resolve our synonym and naming problem with that, because it's like a Rosetta Stone where you have pieces that you can refer to and basically put just a name label on it, because code is basically the basis that we can find consensus on when we try to name stuff, I guess. Yeah. And another thing that I've learned from DG Archive is basically we as a malware research community should definitely start thinking about preservation. Because when I tried to recover as many DJs as possible, I ran into stuff like Xenovol or TDSS that were active around 2008 to 2011 or more. And it's very hard to find samples for those families by today's standards. So even if I'm very sure that they are somewhere in the depths of VirusTotal and hidden there, it's hard to find those exact samples that consist or basically contain the DGA code. Especially if it's not like a first stage dropper or something, but a module that's being pulled, it can be hard to find that kind of stuff. So basically having this archived repository of malware families might be a good idea from that perspective as well. So for related work, so Eric is not here this year, but at least I wanted to have him in my slides. He's been doing this botnets FR project, which is basically a wiki-like structure, also trying to cover many different malware families. But in that sense, it's just metadata. There's also the zoo that was referenced yesterday, because you were using it as a label injection when you were doing clustering. The thing there is basically it's still mostly packed malware, and it's only semi-structured, let's call it that way, because you sometimes have folders that basically contain the same family, or you have one folder containing more than one family and stuff like that. VirusBay is a quite new project. It seems to follow some same ideas that I've been doing with Malpedia, but I think it's more focused on knowledge exchange than actually trying to build this kind of archive that I'm pursuing here. And finally, you have projects like ID Ransomware that also, I guess, keep their collection, but it's basically hidden and not accessible directly. So basically, to outside, it's also only metadata. Yeah, so also the title is basically Inventorizing Landscape. And what do I mean by that? So it's basically a kind of a sling now. It sounds a bit like cartography, and that's basically what my vision for this project in the long run is. So cartography in a historical sense is basically done with baselines. And the fun fact is basically in Bonn, there's one of the older ones of such baselines. So in Bonn, we have this distance of around about 2 kilometers, which has been used to measure a very long stretch of land afterwards. So you basically have this plate, which basically tells you what it was used for. It's basically a pillar somewhere in Bonn. And from a theory, you would measure other points that you can see in the distance, and then by the angles, derive basically the span that's basically between those points that you're measuring. And in those times, basically it has been used to cover the whole distance from Aachen to Zurich, so around about 400 kilometers. And that kind of started in Bonn. So that was just some fun fact that I wanted to bring up here. So applied to malware, we could do that as well, I guess. So if we are trying to collect some reference points for families and versions, we could measure code somehow, or at least do an indexation on it. So that's basically my vision for this whole thing. So I thought, okay, let's give it a shot. And that was basically around about 2 years ago. So for the approach, I thought it might make sense to go one step back and try to do it systematically from the start. So what are probably some goals that you would want to pursue if you build a malware corpus? So I thought there's this work from 2012 by Christian Rosso, and he defined some prudent practices that people should follow if they are doing malware experiments. And I thought, okay, let's review it and try if we can find some things that we can reapply. And from that, we basically found our own requirements that are basically more tailored to our special case, which is basically looking at static analysis. So some of the major goals that you might have in mind there is you want representative data. I think that's pretty obvious because you want to have coverage in multiple angles at the same time. It has to be temporal in a good sense, so you can probably do some historical analysis on malware. It doesn't make sense to limit to a platform because you still can out a piece of the corpus afterwards if you want to do that. And if you want to do some analysis on the evolution of families, you need to have different versions as well. A second design goal was basically to have everything in an accessible format. So it has to be easy to work with, so that's very important. And for me, it was of utmost importance to have unpacked samples, because just putting labels on packed samples doesn't really help. So unpacked is cool, and to some degree it also makes sense to clean them up, because if you have process injection, you might have some fragments that are not really related to the family, but are still present in the memory dump that you're doing. So you have to do some post-processing to have actually really cool data. And while we're on it, let's not just stop with labels, but do all of this metadata thing directly in the same run, basically. Yeah, and finally, I thought, okay, this should not be academically isolated, so let's see if we can find some practical use with it as well. So first off, it probably has to be topical and maintained data. So it's not just that I now dump this whole corpus thing, but I will try to have this maintained. And basically, that's the collaborative aspect to it. I invite basically all of you to contribute to this kind of repository, because I guess it benefits all of us. And finally, it probably also makes sense to provide some tooling so that you can basically work with it. So for me, it was quite important, and that's still a lot of work to have good Yara coverage of all of the corpus, because that really helps us solve maybe this identification problem. Yeah. Finally, Fraunhofer, that I'm working for, is a non-profit organization, so we can step into some degree as something vendor neutral, and maybe we can reach some consensual ground truth here. Okay, let's go back to Christian's work. So like I said, it's basically a list of things to consider when you're doing experiments with malware. And it's basically 18 different aspects that are organized into 4 categories. So first, you want to ensure that you have the correct data set. By that it means you probably have to divide between goodware and malware, that you want to keep balance across the families that you're using in your experimentation, that you separate training data from evaluation data, that you have to think about artifacts and all of that kind of stuff. And that's basically things to consider. Since we are building a malware corpus, the good aspect and the experiment aspect to it basically does not really affect us, but there's still some good ideas to put in. Secondly, you want to do transparency in how you publish the results. So that means that you publish the data set, that you explain where the labels are coming from, which experiment setup you have been using, and that you also do a very scrutinized analysis of your results. So when you do, for example, a classification method, that you explain how true positives and false negatives basically constitute themselves and why they are happening. Then you want to do realism, because you can live in the ivory tower and do all your isolated experiments that you want. If you want other people to use it, you probably have to look at relevance, and that means that you have to look at the real world. And in that sense, basically, the experiments should be designed in a way that's similar to how malware basically is encountered in the wild. And finally, safety is also something to consider, because if you're working with malware, you might potentially pose harm to outside parties, so you have to think about the deployment and containment that you have to put in place. So for us, we basically came down to 6 things that we thought would be good requirements for a good malware corpus, and it's basically limited to static analysis in that sense. So I already said that, so representative content makes sense. We want to do cross-platform, because only doing Windows is kind of no longer the time now. Unpacked samples, accurate labels, and do the documentation part, because we want to explain how we came to that data and basically what the context of it. And finally, that's something probably debatable, but I think the creation should be controlled in a sense, because I want to ensure that the format that we've been using to set up this corpus still stays the same and stays intact, and also this dissemination should be limited. So it's not that you can just go to the website and download everything, but we employ some basic vetting here, so that we can at least to some degree ensure that the data is not flowing wildly. So for representative content, we want to look at relevant malware. That means if we do it that way, it's probably also useful for incident handlers or for other instances in the real world, and that might be doing research. One thing is we favor quality over quantity, so it's not the goal basically to grow the corpus as fast as possible, but rather look beyond what we can now call something like a packer barrier. So if you look at how most campaigns are operated, you will find polymorphism in how packers are basically applied to certain versions of malware. But beyond this packer barrier, it comes down to way less different versions that you can actually observe in the wild. And that means we can basically limit ourselves to only representatives of a version for one family. And that really is an aspect that helps boiling down this data set to only the necessary parts. So just to give you an example for that, we've been doing malware config data mining since 2012 as well. And if you look at Citadel, for example, which was a very popular family at that time, we had run about 100,000 unique Citadel samples over time. If you run all of them, do dynamic analysis, very similar to what we've seen by SerpPL yesterday, you probably cannot identify many more than like 21 versions for all of those samples. So if you're only interested in archiving the code and the evolution of Citadel in that sense, you can probably achieve a data reduction factor of maybe 4,500. So in that sense, we would not be interested in storing all of the Citadel samples, but only one per version. And that's something that you can also observe for a bunch of other families as well. So there's a huge amount of Tinbar going around, sprocs, but there's normally only some mainstream versions because they are maintained by some malware author. And he has to basically publish that as well, and that basically ensures that there's not that much flowing around. So basically this code maintenance aspect that you have on the side of a normal malware developer basically affects them as well. So they probably have to have some distribution channels and are not as fast as pushing versions, or at least not if you look across all of the malware landscape. Yeah, cross-platform, yeah, it's 2017, so let's be real. We had some major incidents over the last year that basically affected non-Windows systems, so just do it that way. So be it Mirai, Lucas is basically twittering a lot about recent malware on Android and stuff like that, so just incorporate all of that as well. For unpacked samples, that's basically essential if you want to do effective static analysis, because you don't want to worry about packers, you just directly want to be sure that you're working on the actual malware code. And here it's discussable if you want to do dumping or unpacking. And I have the opinion that dumping is actually a better way to approach this, because normally some of the intermediate parts that may occur during the unpacking process of the packer itself are not really of interest, unless you are doing analysis of packers. And dumps usually also contain some more runtime data. And this can be decrypted strings at times. You may have some dynamic API usage. So basically you have more API coverage than you would have in a cleanly disk unpacked sample, and do not have to worry of finding the routine that's basically doing the API imports and stuff like that. And it's also way easier to automate. Because, like I said, you can normally just run it and at a certain point decide that you want to take a dump now. Furthermore, I think dumps also can serve as some kind of normalization, because there's certain malware families that only exist as shellcode. So having them on a disk basically would mean that you have to find that exact point where the shellcode is staged by some loader into memory or whatever. But if you say, okay, I'm really just interested in dumping it, then basically I have the same representation, which is memory mapped and initialized for the shellcode, and for every other program basically as well. Yeah, accurate labels and metadata. So basically this whole project is somewhat centered around family identification. So that means we first need to find some accurate labels for the families in the first place. But also there should be, for example, plugins tracked if we are able to find those plugins. So say you have a banking malware which has different information stealer plugins. We're also interested into archiving those as well. Documentation, yeah, like I said, so looking at Christian's prudent practices, basically explaining how we got to the dumps is something of importance, or basically where we are getting the samples from. So that basically allows to ensure that we have accountability and reproducibility. So when we are doing experiments, you can do them as well, and hopefully we end up with the same results. Tracking the origin of samples normally means, since I get most of the samples from publications of AV companies, threat intel companies, and the like, I probably try to include a reference where I basically got aware of the hash in the first place. And explaining the dumping method and environment stuff, we get into that in a couple of minutes. Yeah, controlled curation and dissemination, so the last point here. Like I said, we want to ensure that the structure of the whole repository stays intact, even over the course of time, with having more users and having them contribute to the data. And limiting access is basically needed to avoid harm to the general public. Because if you just download the stuff, let it run, that's probably not a good idea. Or you might have some users that are not really familiar with how you treat malware, and they might just download it and double click it, and I don't want to be blamed for that kind of stuff. Okay, so how are we going to put this now into practice? I will first explain some of the terminology, so basically what I mean if I call something a family or something is unpacked and stuff like that. Then I explain the collection approach again in some more detail and how we produce those dumps. And finally, how the corpus is organized. So if you're later on working with it, so that's probably of interest to you. And also how much data we already have in there right now. So what's a malware family? It's from a modern standpoint, I guess it's not really cleanly defined what a malware family is, and everyone probably has their slight different fuzzy definition of it. So I'm just going to try and give you my current definition what a malware family is. So basically all samples that you can find that belong to the same project from a developer's point of view. So basically the way we are tracking families means that someone normally has the responsibility, has created the code, is maintaining the code, and that's basically what defines a family for me. What this allows you is that you can basically also group those components to this family that only work in context of the family. So be it some customized loader, some plugins that are interacting with the main module of the family and stuff like that. But it also allows you to basically deal with stuff like source code leaks. So look at Zeus. I'm not going to call everything Zeus that's basically derived from Zeus. So we can split off stuff like Citadel, ICE9, Game Over P2P, all the later stuff. In the same way, you can also look at the same project that has been a rewrite. So there's a couple families in there, like 3 or 4, I guess, that basically are the very same malware, but rewritten in another language. So you would have someone start out with Delphi, and suddenly he thinks C is cooler, so he rewrites his malware in the same way, just in C, for example. What's an unpacked sample? So for me, that's a direct representative of the family. So there's no longer other third-party code involved. That's usually used to protect or obfuscate or whatever do on it. So third-party in that sense, basically, I have a malware family or maybe a sample that I've created with a builder and then applied a packer to it. The unpacked sample would be basically, again, the sample without the packer and stuff. However, this does not include, for example, addressing the obfuscation. So if the obfuscation is part of the malware family itself, unpacking to me does not mean that I have to remove this obfuscation, because it's basically a feature of the family and, for example, can help to identify it. And from a classic sense, because that's basically how I, when I got into it, but what we meant when we're talking about unpacked malware, it would be something that you are able to run from disk again. So basically the probably unmapped version that's on disk, you double click it and the malware is running directly. Opposed to that, what's a dump sample? Well, the clean memory capture of the malware, and it normally will include some initialized data, and that's an issue. If you want to go back to the unpacked runnable sample from a dump sample, you normally, or sometimes have the point that this initialized data basically will interfere with you and the sample will just crash. But dumping can also include that you look at some auxiliary modules that the malware might have, or some of the other memory that it has allocated, where it's, for example, storing some of its imports or some additional code that it is jumping to, and that you also track that as well. So once more, this quality over quantity thing. The philosophy that I've been pursuing is I rather want to extend the coverage to as many families right now as possible than going deep into a single family. So I could basically say I want to have the best coverage of Dridex and TrickBot and what, but that would probably take a lot of my time that I can allocate to things. And right now, still the idea is to get a good coverage in the wide sense. So that's basically this quality thing that you can use it to identify as many different families as possible. There's a strong emphasis on verification. By now, I've been doing a lot of manual work to ensure that basically this is a very clean corpus. So that's also a way to push quality, but it's a lot of effort, let me tell you that. It can also mean that we prioritize on families that are more active or more impactful. Normally, I'm somewhat following my filter bubble and look at the blog posts that I would normally encounter and probably prefer those as well. So by having more contributors, probably this basically will have the impact of widening what we consider as something that should be prioritized. In the long run, it is a really good idea to provide some means of quality assurance. So say you have a Yara rule for every of the families, you can also ensure that your Yara rules do not have false positives on other families, and in the same way that they are still recent enough to find new versions whenever you add them to the corpus. And with regard to data origins, I prefer public sources where possible, and basically everything that's in Malpedia is also found on VirusTotal, so it's like 97%. So I really want to have stuff that can be obtained in another fashion as well. Okay, I said we do multi-platform stuff because it makes sense to track that as we are progressing, but I'm still having a strong focus on Windows malware because that's at least where the most families are still documented, where we have the most history. So that's basically what I've been focusing on with the dumps. The method that I employ there is basically to have very fixed VM states that I use to derive the dumps from. What's the benefit of that? Well, I have very known and fixed system parameters to it. So for example, even if it's using ASLR, most of the static Windows API function offsets will remain the same in all of the different memory segments that you will encounter them. And this allows you to apply some techniques to rapidly extract those Windows API functions on arbitrary dumps, as long as they have been produced by this basically environment. So I'm using mostly Windows XP and Windows 7, and no one is gasping, but it's so old. Why are you using like operating systems that are like more than 10 years old? It's pretty easy because it still feels like most malware is feeling most at home there because you have fewer embedded protection systems by the operating system directly. So my goal is basically maximizing execution success. So I want to have the most vulnerable system there is. And that works kind of good. As well, what can you do as well? Of course, you should install all the runtimes. You want to have all the .NET runtimes because you really have to give your malware a place to feel home, and it has to run and it has not to crash. So I'm really interested in producing dumps, so I have to make it for the malware as easy as possible to run. Yeah, with regard to dumping, methodology is pretty simple, I guess. You just run it, wait, diff the memory that has basically changed during execution, and then filter down to what you think is the unpacked version, so basically the dump. And then you potentially repeat it because you missed something, or there's nothing to basically extract, or what frequently happens, you have to interact manually. And that's quite painful. So if I had to guess, I guess I've spent more than 600 hours of doing this unpacking and dumping already. So on the other hand, I think that's sadly the only way how to get dumps for some of the families, because what you can observe there is basically something that gets mapped, is fingerprinting your environment and will unmap itself if it's not happy. And that's totally something that most sandboxes will not give you, or even if they gave it to you, you might just drown in the data. So I've quite some experience, I guess, with unpacking and stuff. So in many cases, it was more natural to me to just look quickly at something and then try to cover it up that way. In many cases, what you can dump there is already fine, but sometimes, like I said, you will have some overlay of, for example, the packed sample and the unpacked sample in the beginning of the same buffer or something, so it makes sense to basically cut off the tail and things like that in order to clean up the malware. Because if you're later applying static analysis methods to it, you really only want the code of the actual malware family and not the shaft that's basically on its tail. Yeah, and for identification, yeah, the better your Yara coverage is, the faster you can do it. Otherwise, it's also manual investigation. Has someone basically blocked somewhere about those strings that I've just found in this buffer that I'm looking at? So, a lot of work. So let's open a shell. If you're interested in how the data is stored, basically, it's more or less this tree-like structure. So on top level, you would have platform.family name. And for example, let's take URL zone, something that I'm very familiar with because I have been looking at it for a couple of years. Below the family folder, you would have ideally folders per version. So that basically allows you a direct grouping. In those folders, you would have samples stored as SHA-256, and along them, you would have the dumps with basically the base address from where they have been dumped, as well as unpacked samples in some cases, not all cases. And that's basically the whole repository structure for all of the data that's right now in there. Along with that data, you have a JSON file that gives you some meta information, like the block references that I've just mentioned, the last time it was updated, aliases for the family, actors that have been observed using the family, and all that kind of stuff. For many of them, there's also a Yara folder sorted by TLP with rules in there. So basically everything beyond TLP-wide are already contributions by users of the framework. And you would have one Yara file per Yara rule, because it also eases versioning and management of the stuff. So now the good thing about this kind of file system-like structure is this is basically our Git repository format. So if you want to have the data set, it's as easy as doing git clone. And you have all of the data at once. And if you want to do updates, you do a pull request, basically a git pull, and then you have the most recent version of it. So that was our vision of having it in a convenient way so that you can do the same experiments or whatever you want to like with that data set. So this commit, as shown there, is basically the root commit, and it's also the commit that we've been using for all of the analysis that I'm going to show in a few minutes. And this, at that time, was based on 17 or almost 1,800 samples with around about 600 families. If you look at the distribution, of course, Windows is the majority. That's also probably the reason why because I'm feeling most at home with Windows malware. I normally try to include Android whenever I see someone talking about Android malware and stuff like that, and same for the other families. And everything that's basically multi-platform is either written in Java or some JavaScript, like, for example, used by Tola and stuff like that. So basically Chrome extensions and whatnot. With regard to unpacking and dumping, about 90% of the Windows stuff is actually, at least from a family perspective, dumped with at least one dump. So sometimes I have families where I have multiple samples, but only one dump, because like I said, quality or coverage first. In that sense, I want at least one representative for it. And 12% are just unpacked, so altogether probably 75% of the samples are definitely in some unpacked state. Yeah, so those 24% are missing right now. Okay, so how do we make this stuff accessible? I already had said to you that there's this Git repository that you can check out, but there's also a website, because the title was basically a collaborative approach to it. So first let me start with the mission statement, what I want to basically achieve with this Malpedia thing, and then explain some of the trust mechanisms that we have implemented in order to ensure basically access limitation and also contribution quality. The website that's listed there is already accessible, so if I'm just going too fast, you can also, I think, just go to on Google and already search for Malpedia. It should show up in the top 5, I guess. So the primary goal, as I said, for this project as a whole is basically to provide a community-driven, independent resource for this whole identification stuff. So basically, if you have an account on there, you can propose changes to the data set. So if you know of a family that's currently not in there, you can propose it. If you have some samples for a family that I don't have, or versions that you have identified and just want to see them in the data set as well, you can do all of that. So basically what's then happening is there's a group of peer reviewers that will basically review your contribution, and then it's probably accepted or otherwise rejected with a note what you should improve in order to have it in there. So basically just how you would submit stuff to a conference or similar. We are adopting the traffic light protocol. Mark just said his personal experiences with that, and I hope it's turning out better in this project. So most for the non-critical data is basically TLP-wide. So the whole inventory, and that's what you will see if you go to the website, is basically openly accessible, as well as the aggregated statistics that I'm going to talk about and the references as well. Everything else is Ember. So if you have an access, or basically an account for the platform, that basically means you have to keep it to yourself in your institution. There's some resources within there that are designated otherwise. So you already saw in this Yara thing, there might be TLP green, so there's other ways to share some components, but the majority of the data is really intended to stay under. Yeah, and if you want to get an account there, we use some basic form of vetting. So basically, existing community members have to vouch for you. So basically, we know who is accountable if you do stupid stuff. And this might fall back to them. So that's basically a system that's very established in stuff like ops trust and such. And we are basically just using and orient ourselves on that. Yeah, I talked about this peer review thing. So if you don't have data to contribute, but are good at malware analysis and have a good grasp of the malware landscape, you can also do reviews here. So that's also a way to contribute to this project and the platform. Like I said, normally 2 votes are required to either accept or reject a proposal, so you get some more sort of grounds to base a decision on. And what we're also planning to do is doing some achievement stuff. So if you're frequently reviewing things, so right now it's just fantasy points and you cannot do anything with it, but in the long run, I guess we might provide some more services that basically will have some quota because they are more computationally intensive, and basically more contributions would allow you to get a higher quota to that kind of stuff. So if you want to defend the Earthrealm together with me, feel invited. Okay, so in summary, the baseline data set that I'm offering you right here is around about 670 families, 2,500 samples, with very clean labels, I hope, and already some contextual enrichment, but there's many, many gaps that want to be filled. And it basically would allow us to have this kind of Rosetta Stone that basically tracks all the aliases that different people are referring to when they talk about malware families, or actors for that instance. And depending on how active this thing is going, it can also basically become something like a newsfeed, because if you keep the references added for families all the time, you see what's happening or what's more on vogue at the time, and get all of the blog posts directly from one resource. So it's kind of an aggregator. So it might hopefully become that thing. So it would be really good, because then I don't have to crawl my Twitter feed all the time. We are using basically the reference data by MISP for the threat actor repository, and whenever we are not able to reflect something that we want to do in Malpedia, we also contribute and like adding an actor into their directory or merging some of the aliases and stuff like that. So MISP, really good thing. Then again, we also want to foster automation support. So basically everything that you can access on the website also has a REST API. So if you want to do searches, there's a Python client ready for you where you can just directly integrate it into stuff that you already have. Okay, so now I've been talking a lot about the project and the data set. What I now want to do is basically do a bit of showcasing what you can do with that kind of data. So I had this vision that I want to compare across many malware families and find if there are some similarities or what basically some of the trends of malware authors are. So the data that's been used in this thing is basically the commit that I just referenced, so around about 1,200 dumped files for almost 446 families. And in this presentation, I'm only going to address 3 things. So we have compared PE headers across all of those families. We did some very cursory code analysis because that's like a rabbit hole, and it totally would not fit the time slot of this presentation if we had already presented all of the results we have there. And on the other hand, Windows API usage, which is very interesting because I guess that's one of the cornerstones that we as analysts most rely on when we are looking at malware. So that's the whole inventory of families. Right now, it's probably still easy for you to find something that's not in there, but that's basically also one of the problems, because if you're looking at a lot of stuff in parallel, you have to aggregate to some degree. So what I'm now going to do is, in most of the times, basically look at the aggregated samples per family and then compare the results on that level. So let's do a very short recap of what PE headers look like. So that's your usual PE header, for example. One of the more famous things here that you normally look for is probably the MZ magic, the PE magic, so basically the cornerstones that we use to find stuff in dumps. Then there's also this DOS string thing that might or might not be very common. There's a rich header that might contain some interesting information. There's the machine field that tells you if it's either 32 or 64 bits. then the number of sections. We have also heard earlier yesterday about that, and a timestamp. And for example, with the timestamp, normally you as an analyst, you don't really know if you can trust the timestamp. But if we are able to compare this across 450 families, we might get a trend how often this timestamp might be an actual value that's basically realistic or not. There's also characteristics fields that defines how the malware basically can be loaded on the system. You might have a linker info that tells you some more about how this thing was potentially compiled, which operating system is required in order to be able to run it, the subsystem. In that case, it's like the value 3, so it means a console application instead of a GUI application. DLL characteristics, those contain a bit of information about the security that this file is capable of handling on, for example, if it supports ASLR or not. And then finally, you also have those 11 data directories that also contain some interesting data. So the above diagram may or may not include some Easter eggs, and it's up to you to find them. So for the result presentations, it will be in that kind of table. So on the left side, across all of the samples, and on the right side, aggregated per families. So let's first have a look at how often you will normally encounter some kind of MZ or PE magic at all. And here the good news is, taking this as an indicator for the availability of PE headers, in a good 95% of the families, you actually find this stuff, and you can extract information from some kind of PE header. So what you can see here is I have some more that I can basically extract from that are having MZ magic. So sometimes you can see that malware is basically just deleting the MZ or just the PE, but otherwise the header stays intact. But only basically just one part of the story, because there's more funky stuff happening. So some of the reasons why you might not find a PE header in that case. So for a good 30 families, you would have 18 times position-independent shellcode. That's basically not in need of a header. 7 times, basically, the segment that's executed would directly start with some data, or in 5 cases, you would have an IIT instead. And for 7 families, you can find that 5 of them basically null the whole PE header. So with some more effort, you can basically extract it before it's nulled. And for 2 families, you can also observe that it's XORed. So one does it with a 1-byte pattern, the other one with a 4-byte pattern. So that's a bit inconsistent. So up there you can see 27 versus 37 families. The reason for that is basically that only some versions of some families are using those destruction of PE headers. Yeah, DOS strings are also available in like 90% of the cases. In general, you will find 3 different variants for those. So basically, the most prominent, this program cannot be run in DOS mode, but the other ones are basically mostly tied to Delphi. So that's one of the easy ways how to spot all in compiled stuff. Rich headers are a bit less common, so you will only find them across all of the families in around about 60% of the cases. It's a proprietary standard by Microsoft that basically encodes how many times things have been compiled with Microsoft Visual Studio, and also with the different versions of Visual Studio that may have been present on the system over time. There's a paper from DIMVA this year that goes in a bit more detail about that. It's really interesting. The next thing that we might have a look at, so say we have a PE header. The vast majority, again, is 32-bit images. One reason for that is that I've been using 32-bit Windows a lot to dump that stuff. But for about 15 families, you would find that they also have 64-bit modules. So for example, some of the more modern bankers, like WAFDOC, TripWet, basically dynamically decide which of the modules they want to use, Dridex the same, and things like that. And on the other hand, what was a bit surprising to me, almost every 4th family basically has their main module as a DLL, opposed to an exe file. With regard to those security measures, as expected, malware is not really keen on basically having those. So for example, if we talk about relocatable malware like ASLR, it might make sense to just deactivate it, because it may ensure that your malware is running a bit more stably. Same for an X, I guess. So only in about half of the cases you would find those security features activated. Timestamps, like I said, are really interesting. So for almost 90%, we have a non-zero or not Delphi time value. Delphi time value because Delphi 4 contained the bug that basically always included the same timestamp there. And you can also read about that. And now let's have a look at timestamps in a bit more detail, because that's basically what I just said. So if you want to look at the age of the corpus, we can, for example, check when those files have appeared for the first time on VirusTotal. And if you look at that data, it looks somehow like this. So about 90% of all the samples that I have in there are basically 2013 and later. So going more in this preservation direction, if you have basically a lot of samples that are identified and predate basically this border, I'm really happy to take them and integrate them as well, just to increase the historical coverage. And the oldest sample right now is a GOSI sample from 2006. So if you want to estimate the PE timestamp accuracy, what we can do is basically use the field from the PE header and the VirusTotal field and do the difference of them. So looking at those 1,200 dumps I have to start with, I can deduct them that don't have a PE header, then those that have a null field, so they are not really useful in doing this kind of analysis. Another 30 don't have a VirusTotal timestamp because they're not on VirusTotal. You will find some timestamp then that are certainly faked because they're in the future. So basically they would have been submitted to VirusTotal before they have been compiled, so that doesn't make sense. And we can also filter down to this range, like earliest sample until now. So I did this late October, so that's the upper border. And that leaves us with 949 candidate timestamp pairs that we can look at. And here the distribution looks somehow like this. So mine again, this is basically the number of samples. And what we can observe here, a good 10% are basically this black line directly to the left is submitted to VirusTotal on the very same day that you can find the PE timestamp. A good 30% are within the first week, 50% within 1 month. So at least in many cases, it's likely that the PE timestamp will be somewhat correct. So sometimes you have to consider what's happening after the compilation. Maybe the guy gives his malware to someone else, or it depends on the packer that is basically as an external service. It has to be delivered to spam campaign. So that basically explains why you might have some gap there. So altogether, about 80% of the timestamps lie within 1 year of the PE compilation time. So 206 samples fall out of this range. A good third of them has APT background, so that's something that you can observe. Sometimes you get an APT report published and someone 2-3 weeks earlier pushed those samples referenced in there onto VirusTotal and they have been withheld before. That's probably one of the reasons there. Sometimes you have leaked builders. So if you are now using Citadel Builder, it will still contain the same stub as 4 years ago or something. So this means why you might have fresh samples with a very old timestamp. For some families, I know that they've been using forgery because some other fields are also faked. And for the rest, I have no idea why it's that. So probably also forgery or some other results. Then again, we had a look at the compilation of those families. So using detected easy or similar methods, we can identify around about 500 data points across those families. And here, Microsoft Visual C is by far the most common compiler chain that's basically used to create malware. One data point kind of sticks out there. So VC6 is used almost as much as the more recent ones, which was a bit surprising. Then again, VC6 also gives you basically linking against the standard runtime that's always on Windows. So that basically also ensures that your program's not crashing if it's basically not finding its dependencies. Yeah, we also have rich headers for around about 760 different samples. And basically in all cases, it's consistent with the linker field. So you would have a matching product ID in the rich header compared to the compiler linker field. Data directories I'm not touching here because that's also way too much data, but there's going to be a paper. So for control flow graphs, we did some very fast or cursory disassembly on all those families. What you can find there, your average malware is probably around 440 functions in size. So most of the malware is basically around that size. What's very interesting If you look at the correlation between, for example, functional basic logs, functions and instructions and stuff like that, they seem to have a very high linear correlation. So normally you would have roundaboutish 9 to 10 basic logs per function and 50 to 60 instructions per function. And this was a bit surprising because that basically means that there has to be some connections in the code that are probably worth looking deeper on. And on the other hand, maybe personal coding style is not as expressive as we hope when we are using these kinds of codes for fingerprinting authors. But that's basically research in the future. Okay, PDB information, what you basically, I have to speed up a bit, can see there is basically in at least 50 cases, the PDB string basically gave also one name of the malware family. So if you're wondering where all those names are coming from, PDB strings are at least one of those sources. Yep, Windows API usage, so I still want to cover that. So I've published a tool earlier this year, which is API Scout, and it's basically something that helps you with API reconstruction for known environments. So we first want to look at the usage styles of malware. So basically, are they using an import table, doing dynamic loading? Are they having obfuscation and that kind of stuff? And then the frequencies with which APIs are used. So the idea here is basically you can brute force a memory buffer and find those static offsets. So if you're doing dynamic analysis, you're very familiar probably with this import address table format. And the way that normal basically unpackers or dumpers work is basically that they pass the structure and reconstruct it. But in many cases, you will also run into some issues basically dumping and fixing them. So what I thought would be a good idea is basically just looking at every D word in a buffer and checking if it's potentially one of those APIs. And that's basically what API Scout does. It's also having an IDA plugin, so you can directly use the database that you have here for your operating system, get all of those values resolved, and can directly apply them. It seems to be a very accurate approach as well, because I've been testing it on Goodware, and it performed good there. Currently, it's not working on IDA 7 because the Python API is totally broken. Usage styles. So across 380 families that are not .NET, so are directly interacting with the Windows API, it looks like this. So the majority of the families is using standard imports, so a good 46%. And on the other hand, almost the same fraction is doing dynamic imports, another 50% that's here. So those are very easily reconstructible with API Scout, which is very good news. On the other hand, obfuscation for API usage seems not to be that common, actually. So there are some of the methods listed, but it's less than, I think, 20 families right now. But I still have to go deeper, and this statistics will be updated over time, so this number of obfuscated families will increase potentially. Now, a little quiz. What's the most common API call across all of those families? What? Virtual protect? No. Sleep. Why sleep? I guess basically if you want to orchestrate autonomous behavior, sleep is like very generic. You can use it to delay CNC communication, you can use it to delay execution, and basically orchestrate how a program is running. So many of the other ones probably are also usual suspects. For DLLs, very much the same. But I was not really happy because if you look at it that way, you still end up with like 3,700 different APIs used across all of those families. And the graph for those looks a bit like that. However, there's very good news. The pattern of this graph basically tells us that the composition of APIs that you find for a family is probably rather unique. So the API footprint that malware has might help to identify it. And that's probably also a reason why imphash and imfuzzy and stuff like that kind of performs quite well. Yeah. I'm going to skip that. So basically, I've also been doing API context groups. So I labeled another 3,000 of API calls into groups. So you end up with like GUI, execution, string, all that kind of stuff. Because otherwise, you run into this issue that if you look at network, you have different ways to achieve the same effect. So you could do HTTP yourself using SOC, or basically the VS32 DLL. You can use WinSOC or use the HTTP higher level DLLs. And that basically, this API context group is a way to merge them to some degree. And looking at it that way, we can see that not every malware seems to be using network. If you think of modern, or some of the ransomware families, they are just showing you an email address where you have to contact their author and stuff like that. So that might be a reason why they're not calling out to their CNC servers. Same for the other data as well. But what I'm doing right now is mostly showing you data, and the slide set will be available directly after the presentation, so you can read it up also by yourself. Okay, so what's the future for this project? Of course, we want to maintain this data set and extend it. I hope that you like it that much that you want to have an account for it and want to interact with the data. So that would be like a really cool thing. And since it's focused on identification, we probably extend some of the aspects here as well. For research, I guess what I showed to you today is basically only scratching the surface, and the next step I've already begun is basically looking deeper into it. So doing basically code indexation across all of those families. So the major goal would be to identify unique code or shared code across all of those different families, and ultimately getting a better idea how functionality is encoded into malware across all of those different families. Okay, so basically the public launch is today. If you want to have access to it, come talk to me. So I run by the principle of know, met, trust. So if you talk to me, you already did know and met, so that's a good thing. Otherwise, there's some existing users who can now also invite further users, so that's a way how I want to grow this thing organically. With that, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Daniel, for your work and for your talk. Are there any questions? Tom, there.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting project. You talked a lot about executables, and I think you just briefly mentioned something about JavaScript or Java archive, like Adwin, RAD families. How many of those do you have covered? Also like PowerShell malware and all kind of like the non-executable malware types. How much of that do you have covered?
Yeah, it kind of depends on, since I'm mostly looking at public sources, those are less likely to encounter in public archives like VT and stuff like that. So if you have pointers to them, I'm very happy. So I think right now it's maybe like 30 families or something. So it's not as much certainly as the other ones.
Okay. Thanks.
There is a question just right there, Anna.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was seems like a really great tool. My question is very simple. Can I get an access?
Huh? Yeah, sure. So that's basically what I just said. So come talk to me and we can arrange that kind of stuff.
Okay. There is a last question over there.
Hi Daniel, great research. When describing the malware families, are you just focused on static parts, or do you also describe based on the behavior?
So right now, it's really focused on static analysis because I want to have clean dumps, because that is something that we can disassemble and then dive into. So that's the idea here. I do not intend, for example, to have like cookie reports for all of that stuff. So that's probably also not representative because you always have the packer in front because there's no clean unpacked sample. And you don't know where basically to cut into the runtime behavior, more or less. But that's basically something that you could do by just using the data, for example. So if there's another one who wants to pick up that stuff and present those cookie runtimes, happy to do so. Okay.
Thanks, Daniel.